Thank you so much for just showing up to protect vulnerable, unaccompanied migrant kids. That's why we're showing up. We want to know how we can help kids who are showing up at the border and those who are already here in the US. I know that we have community members from Women of Welcome, from Be the Bridge, and from We Choose Welcome. So thank you for just joining in this community all together. This is so great. This is so great. Okay. If you have to drop off, this is recorded for Friday's newsletter, so you can get it then. So tonight we are going to be speaking with one of our friends, Jennifer Podkul at Kind, Kids in Need of Defense. And our relationship with Kind has really spanned several years, really ever since the separation of kids from their parents in 2018 during the zero tolerance policy implemented by the first Trump administration. And since then, we have had numerous calls together with Kind, as well as local proximity events in child immigration court in various cities around the country together. And we hope to be doing more of that in the coming years. So just stay in touch with the community, stay in tune for that. I say all that because, Kind, while not a faith-based institution, is a trusted friend in our welcome work. And we are so grateful that their team continues to invest in our community's education around migrant kiddos and their unique legal needs. So her team is a group of trusted human rights, legal professionals, lawyers, attorneys who care deeply about children, regardless of their citizenship. And so we are so thankful for them. Our friend Jen Podkul, wave Jen so everyone knows who you are. Okay, she is the chief of global policy and advocacy at Kind, and she is an international human rights lawyer and expert on child migration in the United States. So she's going to answer as many questions as we can get to in the next hour. You guys submitted a lot of questions. We tried to group them all together. Some of them are going to be high level and some of them are going to be specific, but we're going to just try and get through as many as we can, and that makes sense for the moment that we're in. So we're just going to dive in. Actually, I feel like maybe I should pray first. I think I'm just going to pray for this moment. This is a moment. Okay. Heavenly Father, we come to you with just open hands tonight. We're in a moment in our country where we need wisdom. We need to move our compassion forward with conviction and charitability and kindness, but also to create much needed change. So Lord, we care about precious, vulnerable children who are made in your image and deserve protection, and they deserve our voice. So would you just be over this time together? Would you bless Jen and her team? Would you give us scripture as women of faith to enter into this space well and use our voice for your glory and the health of the church? And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, here we go. I'm just gonna run through it here. Okay, let's start with the current landscape. I think I'm gonna have to unmute you, Jen. Let's see here. How do I do this?
Yep, here I am.
Okay, all right, good. Let's start with the current landscape of unaccompanied migrant kids. Let's answer some basics first. We kind of all need to get on the same page, and we're all entering into this from different educational standpoints here. So let's make sure we're on the same page about terms. When we talk about unaccompanied minors, what do we mean by that? How do you define an unaccompanied minor?
Sure. Thanks, Bree, and thanks everybody so much for dialing in. I just have to say, I'm going to take one moment just to say how much I appreciate being invited to talk to you all, how much I appreciate this community. You all are so incredibly curious and powerful. I think this is a group that always gives me really good, really hard questions, and I'm always amazed by the power that you have as a collective and your individual advocacy and faith. So thank you so much for dialing in. To answer the first question, I'll just nerd out because I'm a lawyer, and I'm going to give you the legal definition first, so you kind of have a sense of what we're working with when I have to talk about when I'm thinking about the laws that apply to these kids. So an unaccompanied alien child is the legal definition, and that was defined in the 2002 Homeland Security Act. So after 9/11, when they passed the big Homeland Security Act, they defined what it meant to be an unaccompanied child. So it's any child that's encountered by Homeland Security who does not have legal status, meaning they didn't get permission to come to the United States beforehand, like they didn't get refugee status before they got here. So there's someone who's asking for protection and they're not with a parent or a legal guardian at the moment of their encounter with Homeland Security. And that's real important because the moment Homeland Security, like a Customs and Border Protection officer or an immigration officer, encounters a child, the legal process starts immediately. There's documentation and there's files, and if a child says something, it can be used against them in court. And so a child who's not with a parent or legal guardian and they're under the age of 18 in that moment, they're on their own. They're going to be defending themselves in court. And so it's kind of captured at that moment of time. And then regardless in the future, if that child later reunifies with a parent or later turns 18, they kind of retain that definition because of how they're now going to move through the immigration system.
Okay, first of all, super helpful, and you can legalese out all you want here. We want to know all the hard details and facts, right? I think there's this perception that kids that show up at the border that are unaccompanied are showing up. What that means is that they're all showing up alone. And that's not always the case, right, Jen? So it's what Jen mentioned is you could be showing up with an auntie, you could be showing up with a sibling, you could be showing up with a coyote, a smuggler, you could be showing up with anybody. But if you are not with your legal guardian or parent, you are considered an unaccompanied minor. And then, as Jen said, all of those legal ramifications fall into place. So answer this. This has been a question that has been frequently asked. Why are children, and I feel like sometimes the answers have been different. Some of them are consistent across the decades, but some of them are unique to this moment. Why are children coming to the US border right now?
Mhm. So, children leave their home when they're not safe. Right. And they're not safe maybe because there's harm inside their home. There could be intrafamily violence. Maybe there's violence outside of their home that's coming to find them, like gangs trying to recruit them. Kids are often coming from places that don't have strong child protection systems. And this is true anywhere in the world. If a child's going to leave their home, they're going to go to a place where they think they might have support or they know somebody, right? So if a child has a relative in Costa Rica, they're probably going to go to Costa Rica. If they have a family member or a trusted adult who lives in the United States, they're probably going to go to the United States. So we see, I would say, the majority of unaccompanied children still are coming from Central America, but it's really diversified, the countries, the kids that we're seeing coming from now. Haiti, China, Russia, India, I mean, really from all over the world, Venezuela, from all over the world. So the diversity of countries from which they're coming is increasing. The reasons why they come are all fundamentally the same, meaning they're trying to find protection and they probably have some connection here in the United States, which is why they tried to ask for help from the US as opposed to going to another country.
We, as we kind of go and visit asylum seekers at the border and we visit them in shelters and whatnot, we frequently hear those who, and this is just, for our community of Christians, is that we tend to hear people say, well, I converted to Christianity and I heard that America is full of millions and millions of Christians. And so because I became a Christian, this is where I need to be. And this is where Christians find safety and religious freedom. So that's also just something to keep in the back of our minds. I see some men on here, so I don't want to just keep saying ladies. So like shout out to Eric on this call. So that's also just a reason, religious persecution, they have a conversion and then they come to the US and they say, that's where a lot of these Christians are. I should be safe here. So I had a question about this last week to Jen. I said, are kids still being received and processed at the US border? Or are they being pushed back into Mexico or are they being detained in the US? So the question is, are kids still getting through? Are they still being received right now?
So the executive orders from the White House that were issued a few weeks ago almost completely closed the border and said everyone can be pushed back to Mexico. However, it still excludes unaccompanied children, meaning an unaccompanied children should be able to walk up to the US-Mexico border and go to a US official and say, I want help, I want to ask for protection. They should still be let in according to the letter of the executive order. We don't have a good sense quite yet. We're doing monitoring, we're talking to partners. There are a lot more Mexican military officials on the Mexico side of the border. It's unclear if they're stopping any children from going to present or not, because the numbers that we've seen trickle into the US system have been very, very tiny, like single digits every week. And it had been hundreds at a time, and so the numbers are very, very small, which makes us think that they are still being received. Maybe they're either being erroneously turned around by customs officials, border protection officials, or Mexican officials. And there's a lot of fear, and I think populations, asylum seekers, those asking for help from the United States are scared right now because there's so much confusion about what's allowed and what's not being allowed and what's going to happen to someone, that it seems like a lot of people maybe are waiting to decide what they want to do, which may be another reason why we haven't seen huge numbers of children enter as of late.
Okay, so for those kids that are being processed, just let us revisit really quickly the process upon arrival. If they are indeed unaccompanied and are allowed in and received, what is that process when we receive a child at the border?
So the process for this population is laid out in a law, in an anti-trafficking law from 2008. The 2008 reauthorization of our big national trafficking law has a section just for this population because they're so vulnerable and they're at such a high risk of exploitation and trafficking. So what the law says is, unlike adults, you can't just push them back or do a quick process at the border. They need to be screened, and they need to be screened for trafficking risk, and they need to be screened to make sure that they don't have an asylum protection, or they don't have fear of persecution returning to their country. So what does that actually look like? If a Border Patrol agent encounters a child and they deem they're unaccompanied, so they're not with a parent or legal guardian, they start deportation proceedings against that child immediately, right? Like any other adult, they would start the deportation proceedings, but they're going to call Health and Human Services, and Health and Human Services runs federal shelters for these children. So they're going to say, hey, we have a 5-year-old here who's not with a parent. We need you to come get them and take them to your shelter. They've started the deportation paperwork, but the child's going to go into a federal shelter that's run by Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services then is tasked with figuring out, is there anyone in the United States that can take care of this child while they go through the deportation court process? They make phone calls, they do background screening, they do fingerprinting to make sure it's a safe person. They interview the child, they make sure the child wants to go with that person. And the adult who's come forward says, I will take care of this child and I will help them go through their whole immigration court process, and they can live with me and I will take care of them at no cost to the government. So that is still continuing. That whole process is still continuing. There's shelters all over the country. There's thousands of children who are still in the shelters who are getting paired up with a sponsor right now. Now, there's different categories of sponsors. So the government first looks for a parent immediately, right? That's kind of the first go-to. Is there a parent in the US? That's a category 1 sponsor. That's going to be kind of best case scenario. There's no parent or legal guardian, they're going to look for another close family member. Is that a sibling? Is that a grandparent? Is that an aunt or uncle? A close family member who can come forward. They ask for proof of the relationship and do criminal background checks to make sure the child would be safe. The third category is a close family friend. So there could be a situation the government's willing to release a child to someone who's not related to them if they have gone through different checks for that. And then the fourth category is for kids who have nobody in the US who's willing to come from them, or somebody came forward for them, the government doesn't feel comfortable releasing the child to them for whatever reason. Those kids stay in federal custody for the years that it takes for their case to go through the immigration court process.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So you touched on something that I think everybody probably sprang up in their mind. There are huge headlines now. Where are unaccompanied kids? So first question is, where are most unaccompanied kids right now if they are in the US? And then we keep hearing these really big headlines about missing kids. 300,000 missing kids, 75,000 missing kids. Where are they? So the question is, where are most of the unaccompanied minor kids now that we know? What is their placement situation? And then what should we know about these big headlines when we see missing kids? Are migrant kids really being trafficked in the US? So
Mhm. Mhm.
help us understand.
Yeah, so like I said, so they're going to go from federal custody, right? And they go through that screening process. They're living in like a group home or a shelter. Usually about 30 days it takes for the government to find an adult and do the background screening. Now, remember, a lot of these kids, the reason why they came is because they have someone in the US. So they're generally coming with a phone number, name, address of where they want to end up. So it takes the government about 30 days generally is the average. After 30 days, they go live with that sponsor. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, gets the information from ORR. They're like, okay, we are being told that ORR is going to release this child to the sponsor. This is their address. And then this is the court date that they have. They're supposed to go to court in Chicago, right? They're living with their mom in Chicago. They're supposed to go to court in Chicago in 2 months. ORR, after they've released that child and they've told Immigration Customs Enforcement where that child is, or the Health and Human Service will do a phone call 30 days later to check. Hey, how's it going? We released you to Chicago. How's Chicago? Are you enrolled in school? Did you figure out where the court is and you know how to get there and you know you have to show up? Have you tried to find a lawyer for yourself? Do you have food? Is everything going okay? So that's a 30 days after the child gets there. They do one phone call, like a check-in. This number of missing children that we keep hearing about, that's the number of children who did not answer the phone for that 30-day check-in, right? So they didn't pick up the phone. So that doesn't mean they're not living there. That could mean the phone number changed. They didn't answer if they didn't recognize the phone number. I'm guilty of that. If I don't know who it is, I usually don't pick up. That could mean that maybe they ended up moving to a different place. That doesn't mean that they're not going to court. They could already be going to court. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lawyer or they're not enrolled in school or something happened to them.
Or it could be that they've just called during working hours because that's when they work, and the family that is sponsoring them is also at work and
Exactly.
couldn't answer whatever. So the number of missed calls does not equate to
Missing.
kids.
Yeah, but there's kind of another tranche of cases in this calculation. Not all the paperwork that Border Patrol started when they encountered the kid right away has been filed with a court. So if a kid's picked up in Harlingen, Texas, and they know they're going to mom in Chicago, sometimes they'll wait and they'll, instead of filing the court paperwork in Harlingen, Texas, they hold on to it and they say, okay, we're just going to file it in Chicago where the kid's going to end up. So they wait a little while. It's called prosecutorial discretion. They'll wait a little while. Not all of the kids who entered in the past year or two have had their paperwork filed in the court where they're going to be yet. So that whole tranche of cases has also been referred to as kids who are missing because they haven't showed up to immigration court yet because their paperwork hadn't been filed yet. So there's a couple different categories of situations that are kind of being lumped together and shorthand called missing. Doesn't mean the sponsor doesn't know where they are. That doesn't mean that they haven't already showed up to immigration court. What that means is, or that they filed their asylum application. It could mean a missed phone call. It could mean the paperwork hasn't been filed with the court yet. And so there was, I think coming from a good place. It's coming from a good place. Everybody wants these kids to be safe. No one likes the idea of we have not kept track of a child who is particularly vulnerable. But there's a little bit of confusion over when we say missing, what does that mean? And I think there's been a little bit of a hyperbole that every single one of them must be being trafficked right now. Now, it's understandable, right? We've all seen the news articles about kids ending up in exploitative labor situations, working in dangerous jobs at nighttime. Everyone's worried about that. So, but I think there's been a little bit of a hyperbole in terms of what's actually happening to these children and are they all truly actually being trafficked or not? What I do think, though, is true is, and my organization, Kind, where I work, we provide lawyers for kids and we provide social workers for kids. Not all the kids are getting lawyers and social workers. So once that kid goes and lives with the sponsor, they're not all getting anything more than that 30-day phone call. That's not appropriate either, right? We want to make sure that the service providers whose job it is to serve these kids or connecting with the kids and having eyes on them to make sure none of them are ending up in exploitative or dangerous situations. So again, it's a long answer, right? It's longer than what you're usually going to hear on a media interview. But that stuff really sticks in our head because we're so worried about the kids, right? And feeling like we don't know where they all are is very worrisome. But I think, Bree and I will get to it. I have a lot of ideas on ways to make sure that we can, kind of keep a set of eyes on kids, make sure that they're staying in the system, that they're complying with the immigration court process so that we're not seeing kids ending up in dangerous situations.
Do you suspect, like, I mean, obviously a portion of that, I mean, so many of us in this welcome community are adoptive moms or involved in foster care, and we kind of know some of the cracks in the system. So in your mind, how much of that population of unaccompanied kids do you really worry that maybe are in very exploitative situations? You don't,
Mhm,
what I'm perceiving is that you don't think it's the vast majority.
mhm.
I mean, but I'm sure, are there kids that you believe that are probably being exploited, and how big of a population do you think that might be?
Yeah, it's so hard to know. And I will say, look, my first 2 years of my career, I only provided legal representation to children who had been victims of human trafficking. So I kind of saw the gamut of the kinds of situations. Someone, poor girl whose brother was trafficking her, girls who were victims of sex trafficking. I've kind of seen the whole gamut of it. Kids who were working on forced to work on a farm. So it is happening. Is it all 300,000 of them? There's no way. Is it a very small percentage of them when we have kids falling through the crack? I think so, because we're not providing true follow-up services that are needed for all of the children.
Okay, that's great. That's good to know. Really good to know. So, one question that's just a little bit off to the side before we switch gears to what's happening actually as of last week is, what is happening? What are you seeing that's happening to US citizen kids whose parents are undocumented and being deported? We're knowing, or at least we're being told, that parents usually will have this choice, this unimaginable choice, to be deported with their kids or to leave their kids here in the US with somebody. What are you seeing in all of your kind of representation of kids? What's happening to kids whose parents are deported because they're undocumented, but they have birthright citizenship?
Yeah. There's so much fear right now that I'm not sure all parents are always clear that they also have the right to make the decision about what happens to their child, right? If they are picked up and they're being held and they're being deported, they don't always know maybe that they even have the right to make a decision. The child, right, has a right to have their voice and have their wishes heard by any decision maker. So for the US citizen kids, it's real important that the local kind of foster care communities, child services, child welfare understand what the options are so that the child can really be oriented, that the communication can continue with the parent so the family can decide what's best for them. Um, we're not seeing that everyone's fully aware of kind of the rules and the regulations and their rights. So there's organizations like Kind who are doing a lot of preparation to help communities prepare and have parents kind of anticipate and be able to make decisions ahead of time and talk to their kids about it beforehand so that the family can execute a plan for what's going to be best for them. So we're very worried about these US citizen kids who have all the rights, of any other US citizen, regardless of their parents' immigration status, not being aware of what their options are, their parents not being aware of it. So it's something that we're working very closely with, trying to train judges, trying to train attorneys who work in the child welfare system so that they understand this population and that they can really serve them and really focus on what's in the best interest of the child.
A lot of complicated stuff, Jen. Super thankful for your team. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit to some of the most recent news about keeping legal representation intact for these kiddos, and also just this latest instruction from the current administration directing ICE to expedite deportations of unaccompanied minors.
Mhm.
Um, all just super concerning. We had a bit of whiplash last week concerning legal representation and stop work orders, and then rescinding of the stop work orders. So I want you to explain to us a little bit about what happened last week and why it is so important, even though the stop or work orders were rescinded, why we need to keep paying attention and using our voice for what happened last week. And then let's just address what's going to happen or what's being directed to happen via ICE and deporting kids. So let's start with last week.
Sure. Let me just back up one step too and just kind of explain why it's so important for kids to have lawyers in the first place. Like, so I was saying, right, kid leaves federal custody, they're in deportation proceedings, which take a long time, right? As you can imagine, I don't think I need to convince you all that it's important for a kid to have a lawyer when they're in court. Nobody gives them one. Now, the government has a small pot of money that Congress has given. Health and Human Services has some money that Congress has given them to provide post-release services for kids. So make sure that a social worker or a lawyer connects with the child. About still, even with that money, about less than half the kids have access to anyone to help them. But it's a huge service. So groups like Kind get money from the federal government to provide lawyers to these kids while they go through their deportation proceedings. Now, like I said before, one of my cases, there was a girl that had come into my office. It wasn't until she came to my office and we were alone and we had attorney-client privilege, everything she said to me was confidential. Did I find out that her brother was keeping her home, not letting her go to school, and forcing her to work, right? It was only because somebody was responsible for engaging with her, interviewing her, having a confidential relationship with her, that I was able to identify what happened to her and get her out of that dangerous situation and get her to a safe home. So the importance of having an attorney cannot be understated for these kids. They need somebody who's looking out for them and helping them go through this process. It's a complicated process. It's a long process. They need somebody to engage with them. So this money that the government provides, we use it to recruit actually private attorneys. So attorneys who work at big law firms and corporations, we help them, we connect them to the kids so that they can take these cases for free. So we're leveraging this public money to really get a huge army of attorneys to try to represent and accompany these children through the process. Last week, out of the absolute blue, we got notice from the government and they said, "Thank you very much for your work. Please stop. Don't call us, we'll call you and let you know when to start again." And it was paralyzing. I mean, we go into detention facilities every day to talk to kids, to explain to them their rights and what's happening to them. We have court dates, we have filings we need to do, we need to show up with courts. And we're a nonprofit organization. We don't have a lot of reserves. If we can't bill our time to the government, we don't have a lot of our own money that we're able to continue paying for the lawyers and working. So it was utter chaos last week. Do we have to fire people? Can we furlough them? Who is going to take this child to court on Thursday? There was an asylum hearing on Thursday. What does that mean if we're told to stop working on Tuesday? The judge is not going to let us out, right? We have a legal obligation to that child. Once we've entered into an attorney-client relationship with that child, we have a legal obligation to them. We can't, the judge is going to expect us to show up to court until the judge gives us permission to withdraw. So we have legal obligations. So it was utter chaos last week, and heartbreak, thinking, how are we going to start telling these kids we need to withdraw from their cases? And too bad, so sad, we can't help you anymore. You're only halfway through. Good luck. Do this on your own. Sorry, you're not going to have any of the support that we've been able to give you. So it was heartbreaking. I called Bree, I called, other allies to really kind of help raise voices to say, this isn't right. The government can't just stop this right away. We mobilized, we had people calling their Congress members, we had press involved. You may have seen some press about it. We really wanted to try to elevate this, knowing that protecting children from human trafficking is not a partisan issue, right? This is a bipartisan thing that American people care about and really need to continue and support on this. And we got a little reprieve. So a few days later, and I will tell you, it was in the middle of making announcements about decisions to our staff. We found out that they lifted the stop work order, that we could start working again. I mean, it was, if I can tell you, I feel like I aged 30 years last week. I look a little tired today. It was a week. I mean, it was so emotional. What is it that we can do? What can't we do? Can we keep all the people on our staff? What does this mean for the kids? This is a temporary reprieve. It was great news. I think it was a good reminder. It felt like during family separation, during zero tolerance, when People like Women of Welcome and others, really spoke up and said, we're not okay with this, and really were able to change course and affect policy. That's what it felt like. It was, a good reminder how important it is. We had Democratic members, we had Republican members of Congress calling over to the administration, expressing their concern. It's a temporary reprieve, I think. So the contract that we have from the federal government, it's a 5-year contract and it renews every year. So each year the government can say, never mind, we don't want to do it again next year. Like, it's been good. We don't want to do it again next year though. That's up again at the end of March. So we're kind of back on the clock. We're okay. We're going to court. We're able to go back into the detention facilities, talk to children, explain to them what their rights are, help with the screenings. But we don't know how long it's going to last. So it feels like, I was able to relax a little bit on Friday night, but then it was, kind of get right back to it. What was so surprising to us, though, is that same day we saw that ICE had issued this memo that they really wanted to prioritize and surge their resources to deporting children or to expediting their court proceedings and getting them into court, into the deportation process. Again, I think we were so stunned that this happened the same day that they told us we could start working again. And we still kind of have this big question mark hanging over our head, what's going to happen to us the next year. We're not sure why there's such a focus on the removal of unaccompanied children. I think, for this administration has spent so much time talking about their concern for children who are missing or who are not in the system. I think for them to surge resources and make sure that these kids' cases are filed in court, and the kids are going to have a process and somebody's keeping an eye on them and the government's checking in on them and seeing them regularly, comports with what they say about wanting to make sure that no kids are missing. What doesn't comport, it is hard for us to understand, is how are they going to kind of put a whole bunch of kids into the system, but take away something like lawyers, which is really crucial to making sure the system works. We all want the system to work. We want the government to get to the bottom of a kid's story and figure out who could safely return to their country of origin and who really needs protection here. If they can't really figure it out in a fast, efficient way, then the kid fails and the government fails, right? It's a failure for the government not to be able to really figure out and get to the bottom of it and have an efficient system that's not going to cost taxpayers more money than is necessary. And it's not good for kids. It's not good for kids not to know what's going to happen to them, right? We don't want them languishing and not knowing. If they're going to go back, they need to understand how to go back, how they can safely reintegrate into their community of origin. And if they're going to stay here, we want to set them up for success, right? If these are going to be future US citizens, we want them to be successful. That's going to be good for our communities and our country. So I'm real worried that there's going to be a gap between kind of surging of enforcement resources without the match of the lawyers who accompany the kids and help them go through the system in an efficient way.
This is a little bit of a side question, but I do think it's relevant to this conversation when we talk about kids who may not be in a sponsor and may be kind of languishing in federal care. What are the actual conditions in ORR, Office of Refugee Resettlement? Jen has mentioned ORR several times. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is in charge of these shelters. What can you tell us about what the detention centers for children are like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for the kids who are going to be, teenagers who are likely going to be there for about 30 days, they're usually in these really big shelters, kind of big facilities. Certainly not ideal, better for a short-term stay. For a child, like I mentioned, there's about 10% of the kids who have nobody here in the US and they have to stay in federal custody. Those kids are generally...
Oops, sorry. You're on mute, Jen. Sorry.
Hear me?
There you go.
The kids who don't have anybody in the US willing to care for them while they go through their removal proceedings, it's about 10% of the kids. They usually stay in a long-term foster care situation, meaning they stay in a home. So there'll be a foster family that volunteers with the federal government. They'll stay in that person's home at night and on weekends, and then during the day they go to a federal facility where there might be, art programming, or that's where they can meet with their lawyers, or there's some classes during the day. So it's kind of like a hybrid of a group home and a foster home for the kids who it's going to take a couple years for them to go through the process.
And we have had lots of women ask, okay, well, and we'll get to a little bit of this at the end on the really truly like, how can we help? What can we do? But since we're talking about it right now, and you just mentioned foster care, we know that the system is already super overwhelmed with the US foster children. But I do think this is such a unique opportunity for worlds to collide in that people who care about vulnerable kids, regardless of citizenship, this is a way to invite new people who care about the immigration issue but haven't been involved in foster care, and those who are in foster care who don't know much about immigration, to really join forces and say, how do we all show up well in this space and invite new people into this, right? So if someone wanted to become a transitional foster family, that's what we call those who are fostering unaccompanied minors. Is that just reaching out to your local foster care agency and seeing if they do transitional foster family training? What does that look like, Jen?
They're not, because it's kids who are in federal custody. These programs are run by Health and Human Services. Now they subcontract out to private agencies like Bethany Christian Services or Lutheran Services. They have contracts with the government to run these kinds of programs around the country. There's just a few of them because there's not that many kids who are in it, but these are separate and distinct from state and county child welfare and foster agencies.
Okay, so if you felt like you had margin or capacity or just a calling to maybe enter into transitional fostering, where would you go? Would you just touch base with Bethany or Lutheran Family Services? Would that be your best advice?
You
Okay.
would, yeah, you go to their website and you can see kind of what cities they have their programs in, and they're always looking for families.
Yes, we know that well. Okay, so one of the questions we had was getting back to ICE and fast tracking deportation proceedings for kids is when we say deportation proceedings and court cases being adjudicated, some of that like language just gets a little bit intimidating and we're not exactly sure what that means. And somebody asked the question, well, what makes a child a target for deportation? So talk to us a little bit about what this means. Is ICE going to be literally going into schools and homes and deporting kids? I mean, I read a letter just this week from one of our community members where their school sent out a notification that ICE will be doing checkpoints throughout the state of Texas, and all kids on school buses going to extracurricular activities after school in the evenings could be subject to a check and then being detained by ICE. It's like the worst nightmare you could think of, that enforcement getting on school buses while a kid's going to a basketball game or something. Like, help us understand what fast tracking deportations of kiddos mean, and are there certain kids that are targeted for deportation?
Mhm. Yeah, so it seems like what ICE is going to be doing, there's two parts to it. One is for the cases that were never filed in court, like remember kid was in Texas and they're going to mom in Chicago and they never filed it. One big effort, it seems like, is they're working towards, and they've already filed thousands of them, is filing that paperwork. Often what we've started to see is that ICE is showing up at the house to make sure the kid's really at that same address. So knocking on the door and saying, hey, we have this address. We think you're in Chicago now. We wanted to double check. We're about to file your paperwork. Fine. So that's kind of one set of kids who their court cases hadn't started
Making a
yet.
connection that they're not missing, but that we have them and attaching. So it's not
Here
necessarily
you are. Right,
that
exactly.
they're
Yep.
just being put into deportation proceedings, which mean
Kind of
you've been
starting the
deported.
court process.
Yep.
Exactly. So we've had some situations we've heard about where ICE is showing up at the door, knocking at the door and saying, hey, I want to see, is the kid still living here? Is this address still correct? The surging of resources to actually effectuate the deportations for this population has us a little worried. What we're worried about is the kids who, this could be kids who never went to court. There could be lots of reasons why a kid never went to court, right? If kid between the time they were detained in Texas and they went to mom in Chicago, it would have been up to mom to call and try to find the kid a lawyer, right? Or what if mom moved, right? That she gave a first address, she moved to a different place while they were waiting for the court paperwork to be filed, and the mail went to the old address, not the new address. or the kid got scared, or mom couldn't take off of work and the kid missed the court case. That doesn't mean the child's not eligible for protection or that they need safety, right? I'm worried that just prioritizing deportations without actual screenings and making sure, okay, did somebody ever really look at this kid? Did anyone ever really talk to this kid? Make sure they have a case. Are we double checking kind of the reason why they didn't show up to court? Do they have the deportation order because they actually don't qualify for something and they can go back and we're going to do it? Or did they just miss court and the judge had to order them deported? But really, this is a kid we should be worried about because they're very vulnerable. We need to make sure that before any of the deportations actually take place, somebody is just double checking to make sure that this was a kid who got screened, who it was clear that it's safe for them to go back, and then they go back. So it's not about not enforcing the law, but we have to make sure, because just missing one court date could result in an order of deportation. We just want to make sure that they're checking to make sure that this was a kid who actually did get a legal screening and somebody decided it's okay that they can safely go back. Now remember, groups like Kind and other organizations, we run return and reintegration programs. So for the kids who were screened by a lawyer, and the kid said, you know what, it's actually safe for me to go back. I was just hoping to work for a little bit, or I was hoping to go to school in the United States. That's okay. If they go back, we try to connect them with services in their country of origin so that they can get connected and address whatever it was the reason why they left, so that they can stay safely in their community of origin, right? Making sure that when you're going to effectuate deportations, you're connecting kids to those services so they don't come right back, right? That's not, again, not good for the kid. It's not good for our country to be continuing the cycle of, deporting the same person, using enforcement or deporting the same person. Like, let's make sure they're really well integrated. So, number one, starting the kids and putting them into deportation proceedings. That's really important. Like I said, we want to make sure that the kids who need relief can get it. They're going to need a lawyer to help them through the system. And for the government, a judge isn't going to be able to adjudicate the case if the kid doesn't have a lawyer. It's crazy. The judge is going to be giving continuances and it's going to take forever trying to get the story out of the kid without a lawyer there. And then again, it's not about not enforcing the law, but let's just double check and make sure we really screened that kid before we send them back.
So there is a question about, okay, so Kind is just, it's one entity, but like it probably can't handle all the kids that are being repatriated back home. So where do these kids go? Like, who's receiving them? How do we ensure that they're not being put back in really dangerous situations? Are kids being deported to really dangerous situations? Like, tell us a little bit about that. What's happening with kids who are deported or repatriated?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and in the other news we've all been following, a lot of US aid to other countries has been paused as of late. Some of that aid went to return and reintegration programming. So a lot of our partners, for example, in Central America, particularly Honduras, have lost money from the US government and they can't run return and reintegration programs anymore. So that means there's no kind of warm reception for that child. So what does that mean? So a child would go on a government plane to go back to their country. Usually there's somebody from the receiving country's government at the airport kind of checking everybody back in, and they'll say, where are you going? And the kid would say, I'm going to La Paz, 2-hour bus ride from here. They might give them the bus fare that they need to go back to their community, and then that's it. There's no one there that's, accompanying the child, making sure maybe a family member is called ahead of time and a family member can come and receive the child at the airport. And then again, once they get back to the community, there would be nothing there for them. If a child's connected to a return and reintegration program like Kind runs or other organizations run, they have somebody there that's already talked to them. Okay, what is it you're looking for? Hey, I really want to work and I'm interested in this kind of work. Great. We're going to make a connection with the local company that does something like that. You can have an interview, really try to help set them up for success when they go back to their community.
That just seems so overwhelming to think about a child navigating all of that. And just the trauma of that experience, going back, it just seems, and again, just all of us, who aren't lawyers, it just really does beg the question, like, what can we do? Which is what we're going to cover in the next 10 minutes or so. But I did want to ask you before we get to that, what can we do who are not lawyers? What can we do? But let me ask you this first. Overall, when you look at the landscape of the last, since January 20th, when you look at the political climate and the landscape of what is happening with immigration, what are your biggest concerns about unaccompanied kids and migrant kids in the US in this current climate? What is just blaring alarm for you right now?
Yeah. There's so much fear and chaos right now. I mean, even I was explaining last week what it was like for us, as an organization, kind of with this back and forth. And imagine being someone who doesn't speak English very well. You're getting your news in another language. You're trying to interpret what's going on. What does that mean for your family? And you're scared about going to school. I mean, I'll tell you, kids are not showing up for some of the interviews with their lawyers. They're too scared to even come to our offices. They've been to our offices, they know us, they trust us, and they're just scared to go places. So I'm real worried that a child who is in need isn't going to be able to know or have someone to go for help, their lawyer or a teacher if they're too scared to go to school. That this fear is really going to be pushing kids further underground, which we all know makes them more vulnerable to any sort of exploitative situation or someone who wants to do harm to them. That's my biggest concern. I think having sunlight, having somebody have eyes on them, kind of sunlight on what's going on, making sure that they're in the process, that they're comporting with all the rules. That's what we want, because then we can make sure that nothing bad is happening to them.
Ooh, that's a major prayer point right there, everybody. Okay, so we hear all this and then we're just like, well, I'm just an everyday person. I don't know immigration law. What can I actually do? What is, in your opinion, the best thing that we can do to
Mhm.
help?
Yeah. I mean, I think talking about it to anyone who will listen. And I think look, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I'm very humble about this. Immigration law is incredibly complex. I know like a small sliver of it. I don't understand a lot about employment law or business law, immigration law, or there's a lot about it I don't know. I know this kind of, narrow area. And I think a lot of people come at this like, this seems like a real big problem. I don't understand it, or I don't know how to fix it all. So maybe I'll just wait and let somebody else kind of speak up about it. And that's not the solution. I think, again, we all learned during zero tolerance, during family separation, that you don't have to know a lot about this issue to speak up about it, to talk about it with your friends, with your family, with your community, and make calls to your representatives. I'm telling you, it actually worked last week. We had members of Congress, again, from both sides of the aisle calling the administration. We have delegations. I understand in some states, all the senators and representatives on both sides of the aisle are sending joint letters to the administration about this topic. This really is something that's a bipartisan issue and really has support. I mean, the trafficking bill was passed with almost every single vote in the Senate. It was 99 who supported it because it's such a bipartisan issue. Protection of children is a bipartisan issue. And so really talking about this and making it toxic to walk away from children is what we want. So, I know everyone's like, call your member of Congress, and I'm an advocacy person, a registered lobbyist, and sometimes I'm like, I really don't want to make those phone calls, but it actually matters. It really does. I mean, I've seen even just in the past week doing that really matters. And just talking to people about it, because the 3 friends that you talk to about it tomorrow, they're going to talk to their friends, and we're really going to kind of generate this groundswell, so we can really show that this is the population that Americans care about.
Okay, so we just keep hearing this and we're going to continue to keep saying it, that using your voice with your elected officials is massively important. Again, I felt like, oh my goodness, we had, this scary moment of kids not having representation. And then within 2 days, just this onslaught of calls, like it just gave me hope. And I feel like probably gave a lot of us hope that, yeah, our voice is powerful in this space. And if we use it all together, we can actually protect vulnerable children. So I think just a reminder, like, please don't give up. You might feel like you're doing nothing, but you are doing something, and something did change last week. A very, very big thing did change. And like Jen said, this contract for legal representation of children is up for renewal in March. So we do need to keep calling and talking about how very important it is that this funding stays intact. This contract stays intact for kids to have representation. So just keep that in mind. The last question that I have really is, what kind of entities are we looking for? Organizations are we looking for locally if we want to get involved with kids in our own state or in our own community, or find if there are kids in our state or our community that we could be helping with? What are we looking for to
Mhm.
engage locally that would be truly helpful?
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because, my work and the lawyers working on this, we talk about unaccompanied children. And well, by the time they get to our communities, they're not like an unaccompanied child anymore. They're living in someone's home and they're playing soccer at the park and they're at the library after school. And, they're kind of new part of the newcomers, right, in our communities. And so I think looking for any entity that supports newcomers in your communities is inevitably going to include an unaccompanied child who's been reunited with somebody in your community. And that can be anything from, making sure that the food banks have food and the churches are making sure that they're connecting newcomers with services, and the schools have it. A lot of PTAs are doing really great work making sure that PTAs have coats and backpacks, or whatever a newcomer who comes to the school mid-year, would need, and make sure they have their notebooks. So really, it seems like it's a population kind of at the border or kind of far from us or this distinct, but they're really just the newcomers in our communities. And there's already so many connections I'm sure you all have with your communities that are going to touch this population, and it can be really impactful.
Jen, thanks. I cannot believe we kept this under an hour, but I think we tried to answer as many questions as we could. Y'all, thank you so much for just caring. It feels so great to not be alone in this space. And I know it's incredibly heartening to Jen and her team to know that there is an army of us who love Jesus and also want to love kids regardless of citizenship. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to have Tess Clark. I just want to mention, um, Heather put into the chat a link to Use Your Voice Well. Ashley or Brooklyn, you can drop in also We Welcomes call there to action, and how to use your voice well. So there's several links in the chat. Also, this will be disseminated in community newsletters for sure. So thanks for being here. Tess, I'm going to have you just pray over this work. Tess Clark is our director over We Choose Welcome, and I'm going to have her just send us out together. So I think you have to take yourself off mute there, Tess.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much, Jen and Bree, for hosting this and for allowing all of us to join. I've been doing work like this now for, oh my gosh, almost 12 years. And I think the consistent thing that when people ask me, how do you find hope? What's giving you hope? And Eric, I see you on here, so forgive me when I say this, but I say it's women. Women give me hope. And the strength to like kind of keep doing it, right? When sometimes we don't see the needle move in the ways we hope. And so thank you so much to all of you amazing God-fearing women for showing up in all of the ways that you do. It is just an honor to like stand beside you in this work. So I'll pray for us, and we'll end that way. Jesus, thank you that we get to do your work, God, that we get to come alongside you and what you're already doing on the earth. I thank you, God, that you are consistently and constantly bringing heaven to earth. And we don't always see it and we don't always understand what is happening, God, but we are here saying we trust you. Our arms are open. Would you use us in the ways that you choose to? God, I pray for each and every person on this call. Would you speak to them? Would you go before them? Would you make a path for them, Lord, in this work and in this space, God? We know that you have equipped us for a time like this. You have given us voices to use. You have asked us to enter into this space, Lord, and that's why we're here. This is like a divine appointment and a divine moment, and we get to join you in holy work. And so I thank you for that. God, protect each and every child. Lord, we pray for your angels to surround them. I pray for just supernatural protection, Lord, for those who are traveling, for those who are waiting, for those in the unknown spaces and places. God, you see them. Would you minister to them? Would you be present with them, Lord? Would they feel you and know that they are loved by you and seen by you, God? And I just thank you for letting us be your hands and feet, and for all of the things you're doing in the world. We just thank you. Amen.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.